Welcome to episode 2 of the One Life podcast, and it is my true honor and privilege to have today's guest. Today's guest is one of the most historic and accomplished generals of not only our generation, but of all time. His commands include the United States Central Command, commander of the NATO International Security Assistance Force and U.S. Forces Afghanistan, commander of Multinational Force Iraq, commander of the U.S. Army Combined Arms Center, and also commander of the historic 101st Airborne Division. On top of these massive commands, our guest graduated as a distinguished cadet from the United States Military Academy, was the General George C. Marshall Award winner as the top graduate of the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College class of 1983, and has earned his MPA and PhD degrees in international relations from Princeton University. If that is not enough, in 2005, he was recognized by the U.S. News and World Report as one of America's 25 best leaders. In 2007, he was one of 4 runners-up for Time Person of the Year. And in 2009, Esquire magazine named him one of the 75 most influential people of the 21st century. Without further ado, it is my true honor and privilege to welcome America's 4th CIA Director and Army 4-star General, David Petraeus. Sir, I thank you so much for being here with us. I can't even put into words how grateful I am.
Thanks, Deven. It's a pleasure to be with you, and congratulations again on your plight, persistence, and determination.
Thanks a lot, sir. I appreciate it. So clearly you have accomplished an immeasurable amount of success, but I personally, and I think my audience would be curious as to who was David Petraeus growing up? What was it like in the Petraeus household? And if you could just kind of run us through the major points or the major accomplishments in your life. I want to hear it from you personally, sir.
Well, I was born and raised in a small town on the Hudson River, Cornwall-on-Hudson, in fact, about 60 miles north of New York City. We were 7 miles north of the U.S. Military Academy, to which I would ultimately go. It was a wonderful community in which to grow up, lots of sporting activities, athletic teams. I played Little League baseball and basketball, and in high school was on a soccer team that won the championship my senior year, played tennis and was also in the ski teams. Did well academically, enjoyed that aspect also. And we had wonderful churches and ecumenical church groups. Again, just a great place to grow up in the shadow of Storm King Mountain, not far from the Catskills and not even that far from the Adirondacks, right on the Hudson. Did a lot of sailing as a kid. My dad was a Dutchman originally. He grew up in the Netherlands. He came to the United States when the Nazis overran Holland in 1940. He joined the U.S. Merchant Marine, sailed with them throughout the war, and then sailed as a civil merchant mariner. After that, he was a captain, by the way, on a Liberty ship on a Murmansk run, which was a pretty hazardous endeavor. The Merchant Marine had the highest per capita loss rate of all of the military services, and they were regarded as military during World War II. He eventually retired from the sea because he wanted to spend time with his family. And in those days, you'd sail 11 months straight and then have 1 month off. So he became an operating engineer in one of the electrical power generating stations in the Hudson River Valley. There were a number of those as you had the post-war economic boom. He met my mother in Brooklyn, and then they, as I said, moved about an hour north of New York. She was a part-time librarian. They both loved books. They instilled that in their children. Had an older sister. And again, they were very, very frugal. It turned out they did better than I thought they did, actually, but they were Depression-era kids who paid cash for everything they ever bought, including their house, their cars, and so forth. And so we had a nice upbringing. It wasn't lavish. It was a modest home, but a lovely town in which to grow up with lots and lots of activities for kids and lots of community activities as well. It's famous for a July 4th parade, in fact, and fireworks, for which many people come to Cornwall, which is the town that encompasses the village. And again, a picturesque place as well. In fact, Henry Hudson, for whom the Hudson River is named, of course, a Dutch mariner himself, is said to have remarked as he sailed by Cornwall that this would be a nice place to build a town on. And it was a great place in which to grow up.
So then, sir, to build off of your childhood and how you grew up, as you mentioned earlier, you played sports, you did well academically in high school, and that translated to you doing well at West Point as well, and then going off to accomplish what you've accomplished. But to take it back once again to who you were growing up, was the desire to always achieve and the desire to always do your very best, was that something that you feel that was innate or that you developed over time or picked up from your household? Where do you think that came from?
Well, it's all of the above, and I think it did grow over time. I think there was probably a breakout moment actually when I was a cadet at West Point and did really well in certain subjects, and ultimately did so well that I was in the top fifth of the class, top 5% of the class overall, and became more and more competitive. I played college soccer and was on the ski team as well. But I think it sort of grew. My parents weren't fiercely competitive the way that many parents are, in a sense, through their children. They're almost channeling their own competitive instincts through them. They didn't drive me. They didn't really facilitate some of my activities quite the way some other parents did. You know, we didn't have traveling soccer teams in those days, but they also didn't take me skiing every single weekend the way the top skiers in New York State had parents doing, and so on. But my dad was pretty unyielding when it came to excuses. And whenever I came home and offered one of those, he used to say, "Results, boy, results." And that really did stick with me. He was a stubborn old Dutch sea captain again, and he was pretty firm about that. And again, that stayed with me for a long time. And then over time, as the years went by at West Point, I ultimately graduated, as I said, in the top 5% of the class, was a varsity letterman, and also was a cadet captain on the brigade staff, and one of very few who had those three different distinctions, and realized that, you know, I could compete. I could strive to be the very best, and I did strive to do that. After West Point, went to the infantry course, was an honor graduate in the basic course, and then at Ranger School, there were 3 awards, and I won all 3 of those. And I really was particularly proud of one of them because it was actually essentially for your teamwork. It wasn't just about being number 1 in points or patrol grades or what have you. It was actually peer ratings. And so to be able to perhaps, I guess, to be the number 1 overall and also in peer ratings, and then to get the Darby Award, which they didn't give all the time in those days, was, you know, I realized that this is something that I can do pretty well. Now, I pushed very, very hard. I mean, I prepared for Ranger School. I've often said, particularly in more recent decades, I guess, that luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. And I really did prepare for what ultimately came my way, if you will, including service in Iraq and conducting counterinsurgency operations and all the rest of that, something that I was particularly fascinated with as a young officer after going to French jump school and reading about the French experience in Indochina and Vietnam, our experience in Vietnam, the British in Oman and Malaya, various other French in Algeria. Not all of these by any means, of course, happy experiences. But I really did try to study our profession, to study those who had achieved excellence in it, was a voracious reader of biographies about everyone from, you know, Wellington to Grant to Ridgway to all of the well-known military leaders of our times and of recent times. And so, again, it was about striving for excellence. Although at a certain point, I also realized, you not only want to try to be the very best that you can, and you want your organization to be the best that it can, sometimes you need to be the best team player as well. In fact, most of the time, you need to be, again, the best team player. And there were episodes where, I explicitly decided that our job, our biggest contribution, including during the fight to Baghdad, during the invasion, when I was commanding, as you said, the historic 101st Airborne Division. And look, when we headed north, we wanted to air assault, because we were an air assault division with 254 helicopters. We wanted air assault onto Baghdad International Airport. Down in Kuwait, still the 82nd Airborne Division, in which I commanded a brigade and then was a one-star, they wanted to jump on Baghdad International Airport. And then to our front, the 3rd Infantry Division Mechanized, which was a heavy force of tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles, I realized they were actually the best configured, that also spent years literally out in the desert of Kuwait preparing for that particular mission. And I realized that we could make our biggest contribution essentially conducting what might be termed follow-in support missions and helping the 3rd Infantry Division. And so we put our 72 attack helicopters out in front of them and tried to vacuum up the enemy with these incredibly capable Apache attack helicopters. When the commander of the 3rd Infantry Division asked me if I had any extra 155 millimeter howitzer ammunition because they were running out of it, I said, I do. And not only that, I'll give you the entire 155 howitzer unit with all the ammo, because it'll take too long to download it to get it to you. And then he said, how about an infantry battalion? And I gave him, in fact, the battalion that I had commanded when I'd been a battalion commander in the 101st Airborne Division. And meanwhile, we secured the lines of communication and went into the big cities that the 3rd Infantry Division had bypassed, with 600,000 people in them, that would have been all over our lines of communication had we not done that. So again, I wanted to get into this a bit because we should be fiercely competitive. I mean, no one should be proud to be average. We should all try to be number one where we can, but we also need to be the number one team player. And again, I realized that fairly early on, and in particular in certain positions as a battalion commander or brigade commander, where there's a lot of competition with your peers in a division like the 101st Airborne or the 82nd, where I commanded a brigade. You got to be very careful that while you're trying to lead your organization to be the best that it can be, that you're not doing it by trampling over the backs of your peers. And we had an agreement, in fact, on the street, Ardennes Street in Fort Bragg, on which the 82nd Airborne Division units are arrayed. We had an agreement that if one of the other brigade commanders asked for something personally, the answer always had to be yes, and we did. One of my fellow brigade commanders, the great Clyde Newman, who had made 2 combat jumps with the Rangers, called up and said he needed, I think, something like 9 or 10 50 caliber machine guns just before they were going to deploy to the Joint Readiness Training Center. And of course, that affected our readiness and so forth, but we absolutely, I said, when do you need them? Where do you want them? And we got the trucks and got them up to him. So again, it's that kind of approach. You want to be fiercely competitive. You want to try to be the best that you can be. Again, you should never, ever settle for the gentleman's B or be too cool for school. Keep in mind that the soldiers that you'll lead, they don't care how cool you are. They care about whether you're competent, especially if you're going to have that extraordinary privilege and responsibility of leading them in combat, which truly is the most awesome of responsibilities. And as I was mentioning just before we started, our son at the age of 21 or 22 was a 2nd lieutenant airborne rifle platoon leader with the 173rd Airborne Brigade, leading a platoon of 40 or 50 soldiers in combat. And in fact, when I was the commander in Afghanistan, you've got to be ready for that. And again, what your soldiers want is somebody who is deadly serious about mastering the profession, and they don't care about your political views or your social likes or dislikes or social media or movies or anything else. They care about whether you can lead them and whether you understand the drills and the ranges of weapons and all the other very complex aspects of being a small unit leader in the U.S. Army.
So then, sir, would you say that it's a fair statement to make that by you always contributing to the team and being willing to help others, it actually helped you achieve what you achieved?
Yeah, I guess if you put it that way. I don't know that I was thinking about that. I mean, I wasn't trying to achieve great peer ratings in Ranger School when I offered to carry another guy's rucksack in addition to mine up Mount Yonah in the mountain phase of Ranger School. I just realized that he might not make it if we didn't help him out. And, he was a Ranger buddy. I mean, I wasn't thinking about that when I actually tied a rope to one of my Ranger buddies and pulled him. We were just trying to accomplish the mission of that particular activity. And I think that's the approach that you want to have. I don't think you help others because you think it'll help your career. I think you help others because you realize you ought to help others, that you should be generous with your time, that you should, as you get more senior, that you should mentor folks like you. I've been pretty accessible to people over the years. I haven't done it for, I don't know, the peer ratings or something like that. I've just done it because I think there's a responsibility to do for others what many did for me. I was incredibly fortunate to have some extraordinary mentors over the years, from the early days in schools and sports teams and church and all these other activities, all the way through to where 4-star generals helped guide me. Individuals like General Jack Galvin, for whom I worked 3 times personally, starting when he was a 2-star and ending when he was the NATO Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. Chief of Staff of the Army, General Carl Vano, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Hugh Shelton, Jack Keane, Dan McNeil. I mean, there's a host of these individuals who, at key junctures, provided really wonderful mentoring and guidance. And again, much more than just was required by them occasionally being your boss. And lifetimes of correspondence with individuals like that and so forth. So again, I think it's just the right thing to do, and that ought to motivate a heck of a lot of what it is that we do. Again, that doesn't mean that you don't try to be number one. And when I was preparing for Ranger School, I didn't just do the Ranger physical fitness test once and be satisfied, at achieving the maximum score that you could possibly get. I actually did it back to back. And I figured if I can do it back to back and achieve the max on each one, then I don't care what happens, the night before or the morning of, I'll be able to pull out a max there. And again, you do that with everything. You try to prepare to the absolute best extent that you possibly can.
Yeah, I really like what you said there, sir. Just being a good person all the time. I mean, just the right thing to do. And if it helps, it helps. And if it doesn't, at least you were a good person.
Yeah.
To go on to the next question that I have, and clearly you've accomplished a lot, but you've also worked beside President Obama, General Mattis, people who are historic in all of our eyes in one way or another. So when thinking about your own personal success and also the people whom you've worked with, what do you think has enabled you all to kind of distinguish yourselves in a society which promotes complacency and comfortability, which ultimately leads to mediocrity?
Well, first of all, I don't know that I'd absolutely accept all of what you just said there. I mean, number one of my core beliefs has always been that the vast majority of us really do want to try to be all that we can be. It may be that some are focused on other than their absolute job to be all they can be. And of course, people self-actualize in different ways and find rewarding experiences in different pursuits, et cetera, et cetera. But I think generally people do want to try to again, do the right thing and to excel if they can. And what they need is a context that encourages them to do that. They need teachers, parents, coaches, other community leaders that inspire them and enable them and help them and mentor them. And that's what leaders do. You know, the tone that you have as a leader or the style that you adopt really shouldn't be a fixed style. It ought to be whatever it is that is required to bring the best out in each of the individuals you're privileged to supervise directly, and also to bring out the best in the organization. And what, you know, brings out the best in the CIA, let's say, which of course I was privileged to lead, or a hardcore airborne rifle platoon, those are very different qualities, very different approaches, and very different organizations. Now, I mean, what does distinguish people like those that you mentioned and many of the others who are sort of well known in history generally is there's a pretty fierce, I don't know if you'd call it a competitive streak, but I mean, again, these are no slouches. I mean, you don't earn the degrees or the scholarships, White Rhodes Scholar, these kind of distinctions. You don't achieve what they have in their careers without having an extraordinary work ethic, without having been, you know, personally driven, really. I was just actually corresponding with General Mattis, and, you know, we're reminding each other of some books and so forth. I mean, he's another voracious reader. He's famously known for that. In fact, he was called the Mad Monk or something like that along the way. I think we were both called the Monks of War or something at various stages. Those qualities clearly are present. I mean, I don't think people back into extraordinary success. Occasionally they can construct it to look like that. But by and large, people have to get out there, and you've got to scrape and push and drive and prepare and study and train, and focus and all the rest of that, and not fritter away your time on stuff that may or may not really matter. Now, again, different people will have different balances in their life. Different families will accept different, again, levels of activity. I'll always forget one West Point cadet who one time asked me to assess the state of balance in my life. And I was a 2-star at that time, again, commanding the 101st Airborne Division. We were about to go to war. We didn't know it at the time, but literally, I think on the plane back to Fort Campbell from West Point, we got the word that we were going to deploy. And I remember it was an interesting question, because as I thought about it, I ultimately concluded that balance is sort of an individual sport. What is balanced for some people when it comes to work life, work family, may not seem balanced to others. And indeed, I suspect that not all families would have accepted the the amount of commitment that I had to these different positions. I mean, there were assignments where I was getting up, and this is not just in the beginning, this is much later on, where I was getting up at 4 and 4:15 in the morning. In fact, one of them was when I was working as General Keene's Chief of Operations Plans and Training at Fort Campbell in the 101st. He was the commander at the time. So I could be in the office by about 4:30 and get a jump on everything, because we would always break at, I think it was 6 or 6:15 to do physical training for well over an hour, and then be back at it. But, you know, that's what it takes. Now, if you're getting up at 4 in the morning, you're going to bed, you know, pretty close to 9, believe it or not, if you're going to maintain that for a period of time. And then obviously I was deployed for the better part of well over 6 of my final 10 years in uniform. And I'm not sure that every single family out there would have been willing to accept that, would have been as supportive and all the rest. So again, there's a lot of that's individual here. Um, but at the end of the day, people achieve success because they really work at it, and they work really hard at it, and they commit totally to it. They're not just involved, they're committed. And I think it takes that type of approach for someone truly to achieve excellence.
So, sir, you mentioned the word drive quite a few times, and then this leads to the next thing that I wanted to ask was, I feel as if a lot of college students or young people in general are not sure as to what career they want to pursue, what passion or purpose that they actually have. So when a young person is trying to figure that out, what advice would you give them if they don't know where to go, they don't know the next turn in their life? What would you say to them?
Well, I'd say keep looking, number one. Number two, I would also say seek different experiences. You never know which experiences may actually lead you to discover that you find stimulation, reward, excitement, energy, whatever, in a particular endeavor. I also always counsel to seek out of your intellectual comfort zone experiences. And every chance I had in the Army, I always did something different. As an infantry officer, I didn't go to the infantry advanced course. I actually did it by correspondence so that when my orders arrived, I could say, excuse me, I've already done that. I'd like to go to the armor school. I want to just try something different. I didn't go to the war college. I did a fellowship at Georgetown. I didn't even finish the fellowship. I ended up deploying to Haiti as the United Nations Force Chief Operations Officer, which was an extraordinary experience. And there's a number of others along the way. I mean, I didn't go, at one point I had a juncture where I could go to the Ranger Regiment or to graduate school. And I obviously chose graduate school, and I was told that I was committing professional suicide. But I had a great mentor, General Galvin, again, who said, you know, have you ever considered raising your intellectual sights beyond the maximum effective range of an M60 machine gun? And that was slightly in jest, but not totally. And I got the point. And so again, sought to go to grad school. So again, there were a lot of off the beaten path, and those I often found very rewarding. Indeed, what I loved about a career in the military, my career, was that I had the opportunity to do good hardcore infantry stuff for a period of time, and then again, go to grad school or go be a speechwriter for the NATO commander or do a fellowship. So again, the variety and the intellectual stimulation that provided. And about the time that you're finally sort of, okay, I've had enough of this academic stuff, you know, you're able to go back and put a rucksack on and be very, very physical and jump out of planes in the middle of the night with the 82nd Airborne and try to beat all the young paratroopers in the 12-mile expert infantryman badge road march, that kind of stuff. So that's what I really enjoyed, again, about the military. And for those who are looking for what might it be that, again, turns them on, that, again, provides fulfillment, intellectual stimulation, and indeed, you know, some compensation is not trivial, although it shouldn't by any means be the be-all and end-all. I mean, obviously, if that was the be-all and end-all, I wouldn't have done 37 years or 38 and a half years in government. But I think try a lot of different experiences. You know, when I look back, some of the very early experiences that I had actually delivering newspapers, which is what kids did in those days, it was a great experience because I had to sell people on stuff. I had to get up early in the morning. I had to pedal it, whether it was raining, snowing, or whatever, in the Hudson River Valley in the middle of winter. Then I had my own little lawn service. I mean, we didn't call it that in those days. I just mowed lawns, but I was mowing over 20 lawns a week. This is before the advent of the kind of lawn services that you have in many neighborhoods now. Again, it was a really great experience. You had to deal with people. They were your customers, your clients. You had to get more of them. You had to satisfy them. You had to get them to pay you. All of this was very, very instructive. And all of that, I think, gives you great experiences.
Yeah, so basically it comes down to trying a bunch of different things until you find something that sticks is basically
I
what
mean,
I'm getting
you
from it.
might know what it is right off the bat. Some
Right.
people do. I must tell you that I actually at one point thought about leaving West Point, and at another point, at least considered should I stay in the Army, especially as I watched some folks that I respected enormously, including the brigade commander of the class at West Point before me and his deputy, both of whom were assigned to the same airborne unit in Vicenza, Italy, where I served. They both decided to get out, and that causes some reflection. If these extraordinary guys are getting out, and both of those were top 5% of the class, and both of those were varsity lettermen in different sports as well. So again, I think, I don't think you should ever go into something saying this is absolutely it. By the way, especially nowadays, as I look what our daughter and son are doing and their spouses, they're going to change jobs. I think that's much more the way of the current generations. And that also gives opportunities.
Thanks a lot for that, sir. I think that's going to help a lot of young people, especially. So then the next question is a little bit more specific, because I had a lot of people who, when I told them I was doing this interview, a lot of my now lieutenant friends were really excited, and this is really for them. So as you progressed through the military, obviously you started off as lieutenant, all the way up to general. Your scope of responsibility was constantly changing. What I'm interested in knowing, sir, is what core foundational leadership principles that you developed as a young officer, as a company commander or a platoon leader, that stuck with you even to this day?
Well, I think, you've probably heard a few of these. One of these is just a recognition that life is a competitive endeavor, that you don't get a t-shirt or a trophy just for showing up, that you truly do need to try to be the very best that you can be, and not be satisfied with anything less than that, that you therefore can lead by example, especially in the infantry. Needless to say, you lead from the front, not from the rear. You provide energy. Again, you provide example as well. You try to master your profession. Again, this sounds very easy. And most folks would say, sure, I understand what I'm doing. I know my responsibilities, except that I would give a test to new second lieutenants that would report to the battalion in the 101st Airborne Division. And almost all of them flunked the test. And it was actually an object lesson, because I wanted them to understand that this is very serious, intellectually demanding work that you're doing. And before you ask me whether you should read the Washington Post or the New York Times or Foreign Affairs, you might try reading Field Manual 7-8, the infantry squad and platoon, and memorize the drills and the weapons characteristics and calls for fire, all of the different very demanding and very challenging components of being a young unit leader. So again, that has a lot, and that just continues. It's just that the scope, the scale, the breadth of responsibilities, the composition of those you're leading. In my day, we went all the way to brigade level, at least in the 82nd Airborne Division, with there were only men in those units in those days. Obviously now there are women at all levels, including in infantry units, and they have earned the right to be there by passing the very same physical fitness test, and some of them have actually earned the Ranger tab. And they met every standard. There was no female versus male. There was no age. I'm delighted finally that the new physical fitness test will not have age categories. I mean, I used to think, seriously? So the enemy is going to look over his rifle and he's going to say, oh, Petraeus, he's in the over 40 crowd, so I'll give him an extra minute or second before I pull the trigger. Come on. And we always competed head to head with our soldiers. Every unit that I was privileged to command, we had a physical fitness competition, and it got really organized as a battalion commander, because then you have so many soldiers and so forth. There are only 8 of us that ever actually became Iron Rakkasans. I graded every single one of those. And I also had to compete every single time because it was an audience participation event. As a brigade commander, now you're talking about a brigade combat team of, 3,500 to 4,000 paratroopers. And again, I graded every single one. It was not until I was a division commander of the Great Screaming Eagles, where we had the Iron Eagle competition, that I finally allowed, is how I couldn't grade everybody, but I certified all of the graders, and they all had to be airborne, air assault, ranger, qualified, non-commissioned officers. And then even at the staff college, we had the Iron Major competition, and I still competed. And actually, I'm proud to say was one of the top 10, again, on a common scale. Now, yes, I trained for the test. I knew what it was. We told them what it was as well. But I was pretty familiar with the events that we had in it. But again, you really have got to be committed to this stuff. You can't do it sort of part-time or with one eye on Facebook or something like that. You got to really be focused on this. And that's what your soldiers want. That's what your peers want on either side. That's what your bosses obviously want. So that's the kind of approach that I think you should start from the very beginning. And then obviously it becomes a heck of a lot easier to sustain something than to try to discover it anew later on. I mean, never go into this saying, well, this is not so important. I'll wait to get serious about this later on. And indeed, there were some of my fellow West Point classmates, in fact, that were, in the first few weeks of the infantry basic course, probably spending more time at some of the local establishments than they were reading the field manuals. But actually, I think everybody after a certain point in time realized this is pretty serious stuff. And if you want to be a success, you're going to have to really apply yourself.
So I remember you told me once about how much of a standard that you held whatever organization you led to, and you never let that standard waver. And whether it was physical fitness or whatever the case may be. And I'll never forget when you told me that. Could you share with us just a little bit about the importance of that?
Thanks for reminding me of that. I think the example that I gave you was, again, as a battalion commander, we had 5 areas of focus. And I guarantee you that the members of the Iron Rakkasan Battalion to this day could probably get 5 out of 5. I mean, they'll say, oh, Petraeus is nuts about discipline and standards, physical fitness, small unit live fires and drills, air assault tactics and techniques, because we were an air assault division, and then rangering. And that was getting enlisted men and non-commissioned officers in particular through Ranger School. We expected the commissioned officers to be Rangers. And if they weren't, they were going to go. That was not a question, but we were trying to get the others to go. And in fact, we had 3 times as many enlisted Ranger graduates during my 2 years as a battalion commander, 3 times as many as any other battalion in the 101st Airborne Division. I think far more than any other unit in the Army other than those in the Ranger Regiment itself. So, so people would say, okay, of course we want to be disciplined. Well, as I mentioned to you, we had real standards. I mean, it laid out the standards. It told you what your haircut looked like. It told you what your camouflage looked like. It told you how you stood when you talked to a non-commissioned officer, to a commissioned officer. It told you how to rig your gear. And, we put all this out on day 1 when I arrived. And then I said, okay, company commander, I'll be down to inspect your company. We put it on the training schedule, and I showed up, and his gear was out front. And I inspected his gear, and it wasn't rigged to standard. I mean, this is quite meticulous. And so I said, well, this is not the standard. Here's the standard. You obviously didn't pay attention to this, Captain, so I'm going to go away. You can fix your gear. And maybe the others might want to check theirs. Because, again, you got 150 soldiers, air assault troopers there standing maybe in the sun, depending on the time of day. And so we just sort of did that until they actually realized this guy actually means it. And we really did. And so that sort of builds on itself. We had standards, and I mean, when it came to physical fitness, it was very, very clear what the minimum standard was, what excellence was, and what the reward was for that, and what happened if you failed to make the standard in terms of remedial training. And again, we were deadly serious about this. And ultimately, over time, what we found was that people didn't volunteer to come to our unit unless they truly wanted to be part of something that demanded very high standards, which was great. So you had wonderful self-selection out of the same thing in the 82nd Airborne Division. There you have, on Fort Bragg, you have a huge number of majors who are trying to get to battalions so that they can, to brigades, so that they can qualify, the branch qualifying assignment as a major. And they would call up my adjutant or something like that and say, could I have an interview with your boss? Devil 6 was the call sign, by the way. It's a unit, historically, the Devils in baggy pants. And 6 is always a commander. So they'd say, can I meet Devil 6? And he'd say, yeah, sure. Meet him, come down in physical fitness gear and meet him out front at 6:30 in the morning when physical training starts. And he'll give you an hour and a half of his undivided attention. And we did. And, I would never go do anything less than the standard. But if they wanted to go for more than that, certainly, we could end up in quite a foot race down Ardennes Street. And that was great. But we had several individuals who showed up and who realized they couldn't meet the standard. And when I asked them, well, what did you learn by this experience? And they said, well, perhaps I need to do some retraining to standard before I apply. And most of them ended up going to other units. That was fine by us. That's what we wanted. We only wanted people who wanted to truly try to be the very best that they could be. So that's an approach. And standards, again, they were pretty straightforward. And we worked through them, and we had lots of competitions. And as I think I mentioned to you that time you came by the office, every single competition always ended, regardless whether it was for a rifle squad, scout squad, mortar squad, sniper team, whatever. It always ended with a rucksack run of considerable distance with all the gear that particular unit had organic to it. And it finished right in front of the head battalion headquarters where all of the leaders would be waiting. Usually we did it on a Friday afternoon. And we would immediately pin medals on the chests of the team or squad or unit that was number one. So they were very clear about. And every time I talked to that unit, which is a minimum of once a month and sometimes more than that, every single time, I would weave in a discussion of discipline and standards, physical fitness, and again, excellence in physical fitness, small unit drills and live fire exercises, air assault tactics and techniques, and rangering. And I would extol commend the virtues of those who had demonstrated excellence in those different areas. And this is a unit that it won football both years I was a commander. It won the cross country championship both years. It won softball once or twice. It was finals in basketball. It didn't matter what it was. The competition for the chili cook-off, I still am irked that we came in second in that. And, I'll never quite get over that. This is the kind of approach you need to have, though, I think. And again, it's got to be tempered. It has to have a little bit of good nature to it. But you're out there to be the best that you can be on that street, albeit, again, often being the best team player that you can be as well.
So then, sir, is that, because I don't want to spend too much more time on this topic because I know you got a lot to do, but is that the same advice that you would give to a new lieutenant just walking into, for example, into your battalion? Is that the same advice that you would give him or her?
Well, that might be part of it. What you want in a lieutenant also is to be sure that lieutenant understands that this is, often a time to listen, pay attention to what your non-commissioned officers have. Especially when you walk in, you'll have non-commissioned officers who have been in combat. You will not have been. You'll have experienced commissioned officers. You need to be real careful not to be on transmit, but you also need to be ready to make decisions. And there will come a time when all eyes turn to you and you have to make the call, and then you have to lead the way. So yeah, again, a lot of that has to do with the interpersonal skills of how do you inspire someone? How do you set an example? How do you give energy? But how you do it in a way that is going to be seen as genuine and impressive to those you're privileged to lead, rather than, oh, it's another hot dog or another, here comes another second lieutenant kind of reaction.
So that leads perfectly to the penultimate question that I have, and that is, in your job, whether it was as a lieutenant or as you worked your way up, you constantly had to build relationships with other people, and those relationships, I'm sure that you relied on a lot of those at a lot of different times. And as young adults, a lot of times we're told constantly build your network, go out and network with these people. So the question that I have is, what advice would you give to people as to not only build relationships, but also to develop influence over others? Not saying influence is a bad thing, but also positive influence, like you said, to inspire, to motivate, to ultimately make others better.
Well, obviously relationships are hugely important. And there come times when you have to turn to somebody and say, hey, I really need something. Again, as I mentioned, the relationship that existed between the brigade commanders, the infantry brigade commanders at Fort Bragg, and actually all the 6 brigade commanders had that same agreement. And that's what you want to have with your peers. That's the kind of trust and confidence that you have in each other. You want to be, if you go personally to someone and ask them for something, you want to have a pretty high prospect of getting yes for an answer. Networks are important. I'd be careful of just spending so much time, building networks that, you're not really investing in the relationships that matter the most. I'm not a huge social media person. In fact, the only media I'm on is LinkedIn. But even there, you can spend an extraordinary amount of time just doing things that won't necessarily yield the kind of relationship that you might invest in developing with those that are, again, most important to you. And among those, obviously, are your family members. So your neighbors, your community partners, et cetera, obviously those in your firm. So again, I think it's very, very important to build those relationships in whatever organization you're in, to do that in a variety of ways beyond work as well, through social activities and so forth. I mean, you'll have officer hails and farewells, as they're called, to welcome the new people and say goodbye to the folks who are leaving, and congratulate them, usually on a monthly basis or something like that. And again, it takes an art form to make those fun, so that the second lieutenants might enjoy, rather than feeling prevailed on to attend them. Again, we used competition. We had the Renaissance Rakkasan dinner where the men cooked and the women judged. We had all kinds of different events like these, and they were really quite enjoyable. In fact, the division commander showed up at one of them and actually won with his bananas flambe, about which we're still talking to this day. So these are enjoyable as well, and they should be enjoyable. You've got to be careful, and folks have to be very cautious about getting behind the wheel if they've had a beer. But there's a lot of ways, and now there's Uber and Lyft, so that should relieve that particular issue. But yeah, you have to invest in relationships, and those that really matter are ones that will endure for a lifetime. I mentioned with General Galvin, I was a captain when I first worked for him. He was a 2-star general. I worked for him on a temporary duty basis again when he was the 4-star commander of U.S. Southern Command, in those days based in Panama for all of Latin America. Then he became the NATO commander in Europe, and I served for him over there as well as a speechwriter. But we continued for decades after that. In fact, I did the eulogy at his funeral. That was a lifelong relationship, and we'd write letters back and forth. We had unspoken humor. We had code words. He had something called the Big M. Stands for mystique. And, I used to try to help him build his own mystique. That's, and it's fun. And we used to joke about it. And he was the commander of the mechanized unit in the 18th Airborne Corps, which had the 82nd Airborne and the 101st. And so they were all very full of themselves, as they should be. But, we'd joke around with the other aides, and I'd say, "Oh, you guys run with your boss this morning?" And, "Oh, no, not really." I said, "Oh, well, we sort of went short today. We only did 6 or 8 or what, again, we actually would, but these were fun. But I remember at a certain point in time, I think it was when I was commanding the surge in Iraq, he wrote me a letter and he said, "I hereby bequeath to you the Big M. You now are the Big M. And, congratulations on what you have achieved." It was a pretty meaningful moment, actually. So, those relationships are what actually define your life, because next to your family, those are the ones that mean the most of all. And then obviously in an organization, I think you have a responsibility to share a degree, at least, of the hardship and risk and so forth with those you're privileged to command. If you're commanding in an endeavor like the surge in Iraq, they have a right to get to know their boss a bit. And you have a right to get to see them. So again, all of these, I think, are very, very important. And I'm a little cautious about the term network, because that sounds like it's a very calculating endeavor. And again, as we started out by saying, just do the right thing. And then also, by the way, be prepared to deal with adversity, because life is not full of high-five moments. There were plenty of really tough days and setbacks and mistakes in the very tough war years. I obviously made mistakes along the way. And again, as one of my British buddies, in fact, he was my deputy during the early tough days of the surge, Sir Graham Lamb, wrote after I left government, he said, "Don't tell me how high the guy jumped. Tell me how high he jumped back after getting knocked down." And that's another aspect of all of this that we probably should have touched on earlier, which is, again, that the real measure of a leader is responding to adversity, not responding to success. And there will be adversity. There will be mistakes. There will be shortcomings. You want to try to limit your own, certainly. But that happens. And how you respond to those often defines the type of leader that you are. And you can't be hesitant about that. If you have a bad day, you got to go out and tell the world, tell the people, whatever. Today we had a horrible day in Baghdad. There were 3 suicide bombings in markets that killed 150 innocent Iraqi civilians. Here's what we believe took place. Here's what we are learning from it right now. Here's what we'll do to try to mitigate the risk of that in the future, and we'll continue to share details with you. You can't put lipstick on a pig. You can't spin something like that. You just need to go out and acknowledge it. And we had plenty of those kinds of days. Command in combat's a grinding experience. Maybe we can just end. I remember in the final week of the surge, my longtime chief warrant officer, who was the head of the security detail that we had, about 40 or 50 people, we were out late at night. It was inside the huge base, and it's very secure, but he would go with me. Occasionally I'd walk along this man-made lake that Saddam had built in this complex that we'd taken over after liberating Iraq and toppling his regime. And normally we wouldn't speak or anything, because I'd be thinking about that day and the next day and so forth, and I'd sometimes take notes along the way. But that night he said, "Sir, I wonder if I could ask a question." And I said, "Sure, Chief." And he asked, what has it been like to command the surge? Everybody said it was going to fail. The first months were really, really hard, very tough casualties, lots of setbacks and temporary defeats and so forth. A lot of critics, very tough hearings at Capitol Hill, demonstrators, you name it. What's it been like to command the surge? And now it has actually succeeded. And even your worst critics acknowledge it, concede that it has. And I said, Chief, this has been the most awesomely awesome of experiences on a good day. But there have been less than this many good days in the 19 and a half months that we've spent together this time during the surge. And that's what that's like. But again, the privilege of that kind of responsibility is just unequaled. And all you can do is the best you can do at the end of the day, and hope that is more than good enough. The key is being ready for it. And as I mentioned earlier, luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. And I could have gone an entire career without having that particular opportunity. I mean, I'm the only one in the generation that commanded that surge, obviously, and then the surge in Afghanistan as well. But if it does come, you want to be ready. And I'd like to think that I'd spent, 3 decades or so prior to that moment, including some other extraordinary opportunities. And that, you try to measure up, and again, to demonstrate that you have the ability for that moment. And I think if you have prepared, if you've done everything you can, at the very least, you will feel that you did all that you could to be as ready as you possibly could when those extraordinary moments arrive. And sir, I know you'll do that.
Absolutely. I'm trying my best, sir. The very last thing is, I'm curious as to the whole name of this podcast is the One Life Podcast, taking advantage of the one life we have. So I'm just curious as to, when you're no longer here, sir, knock on wood, that's not for another 50, 60 years, what is the legacy and impact that you hope to leave behind?
That's an interesting question that I've not done much thinking about, candidly. The usual answer that someone gives is, those that you were privileged to touch or to mentor or to guide. I mean, obviously it's your children first and foremost. There might be some intellectual contributions that you made along the way. I'd like to think that, some of our work on the counterinsurgency field manual and the different writing and scholarship along the way might have some enduring value. That the historical example or whatever, again, might be of some relevance. That you've actually made it possible for your grandkids to go to college without their parents having to worry about it. But again, I think it really comes down to those that you touched, those you were able to inspire, to influence, to help, to assist, and that still continues. Again, especially in a day of the internet, it's amazing how old soldiers can get hold of you, just like you did, a young soldier. But you'd be astonished at how many of those that I was privileged to command during the surges in Iraq or Afghanistan or elsewhere, the 101st, what have you, come up on the net and say, hey, that was something pretty special that we were part of. And, it was a privilege to serve there with you or whatever. In the final couple months in the surge in Iraq on the 4th of July in 2008, I was privileged to be the reenlistment officer for what we believe was the largest reenlistment in history. And this is in combat, mind you. And they'd flown in from all over Iraq, 1,215 soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines. And here I was, and I would state the oath, they would recite it after me. And I'm looking out at this sea of uniforms and this huge cupola of, again, Saddam's old palace that was on that complex, which is where we had our headquarters. And just asking myself, what is this all about? I mean, this is not for the stock options. Again, it was in the summer of 2008. We didn't know that the economy was about to take a serious tumble. Employment was at very high levels in the U.S., so there were lots of opportunities for these individuals, and they were re-enlisting in combat knowing that they were likely going to be asked to do at least another combat tour during the period of that enlistment. And as I thought about it, I realized that this is individuals who feel privileged to perform a mission that is larger than self, to do it with others who feel the same way, and to do it at a time when those back home, even if they disagree with the policy that we are implementing, appreciate what it is that Americans in uniform overseas, our men and women in uniform, are doing. And that's, again, a pretty extraordinary privilege to have. And, you know, you're about to enter this. You're about to become part of this brotherhood, which now includes women as well as men, and they've earned their place there. There's no fraternity that is more special than the brotherhood of the close fight. And again, you're about to have the privilege of serving with individuals where you might experience that. So again, my commendation to you for the initiative to pin me down and to do this, your persistence, your determination, what you achieved indeed in ROTC, and what I know you'll achieve when you get to Fort Benning. So, but now you got to realize you got to keep me posted. You got to send sit reps, situation reports. And obviously it would be horrible to have to type one out that said that you were anything less than the distinguished honor graduate of your basic course or ranger class or what have you.
Well, sir, I thank you. I can't even put into words how grateful I am having you on here. I know a lot of people are going to benefit from this. And like I said, I'm just extremely grateful. And thank you especially for going into such depth with some of these topics. You took a lot of time out of your day. So I really appreciate it, sir. And I really look forward to speaking to you soon and certainly sending you those sit reps. So once again, thank you so much, sir.
Great. My pleasure. Thanks.
All right, sir. Thank you.